Hello, my name is Sarah Holland. Welcome to the Fertile Mindset podcast. Each week on the podcast, we'll explore how your mind can help you create a meaningful and happy life. And through the conversations here, we'll be planting seeds of inspiration to bring you more clarity, purpose, and joy. This podcast is for you if you've ever felt stuck or unsatisfied with life and know that you want to live in a bigger and more beautiful way. I hope you enjoy the time you spend with us. Let's begin. Hello and welcome back to the Fertile Mindset podcast. I hope you have been keeping well and thank you for being here again. It's really lovely to be back and to share another conversation with you that I recorded a while back and I've been really excited to share. So today's guest is Jo Hodson. She lives in a van that she designed herself while travelling and working wherever she chooses. It was so inspiring to hear her speak about how she lives her life completely on her terms. Before Jo embarked on full-time van life, she lived in the next town to me and we have several mutual friends. When I heard that she had converted a Ford Transit van and this was now her home, I was intrigued and started following her journey on Instagram. I quickly became hooked and I love to check her daily stories where she shares the highs and the lows of van life as well as breathtaking photos of the gorgeous places she travels to and calls home for a while. This conversation with Jo was raw and authentic and shows us another way to live that isn't conventional and may just feel right for some. I hope you enjoy listening and that Jo inspires you to live your life with more clarity and authenticity, whether that's in a van or not. Jo is a designer, writer and coach helping creatives and wellness-based businesses embrace their multiple passions and create a life and business on their own terms. Her business, Create Wellbeing, was born from her career background in the creative industries and her personal journey of plant-based nutrition being the gateway to stepping away from convention and conformity into a deeper connection with her authentic self. And of course, Jo blends life and work into her travels around the UK and Europe, living on the road in her self-built camper van. Within this conversation, Jo talked about her two Instagram accounts and whether she would be keeping them both or merging them together. Now, since recording, she has decided to have just one account, which is where you can follow both her brilliant van life stories and hear about her business and work too. There is a new name for her Instagram account, and that is I Am Jo Hodson. Now, here is our conversation. I hope you enjoy listening. Hello, Jo. Welcome to the podcast. It's really lovely to have you here. Thank you for taking up my invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about all the things that are most likely going to come up. So yeah.
Wonderful. And I know we had to book this kind of a few weeks in advance because you were on your travels.
Yeah, I was traveling through about
Europe.
9 countries in Europe. So
oh my goodness. And yeah, we're going to get into that, I'm sure, and yeah, what takes you there. But could you give us a little intro to Jo and who you are and what we're going to be talking about?
Who am I? Gosh, there's so many things. When people ask me the question, I'm sure I could give any one of like 10 responses. But ultimately, at this point in my life, I live in a van. And travel and freedom and seeing where that takes me, be it physically and like mentally, emotionally, is a huge part of my journey. And as part of that journey, I do a lot of designer work as I travel, but I also pet sit for people as I travel. And so that gives me a lot of structure. So I always say I'm full-time on the road and part-time in the van because I do sort of live in different people's houses as I go. But who am I? Like, I guess that's just such a deep question. I never really answer it because I feel like who I am now will evolve and change again in a month or a year, or and who I am maybe a year ago is very different to who I am right now. And so I suppose the deeper answer to that question will unfold over the next 45 minutes or so.
You may discover it yourself. Who knows?
I know.
As we talk. So yeah, you touched on the fact that you live in a van. almost full time, apart from when you're house sitting and pet sitting and things. So how did that come about? Tell us a bit about that transition, because I'm guessing you haven't always lived in a van.
No,
This
I
was a
haven't always lived
decision
in a
that you
van.
made. So
Yeah,
tell
and I have
us
had at previous points in my life, I have had a very normal life. Like many people, lockdown created a huge perspective shift. And I was already working for myself. I've been self-employed since about 2013, so over 10 years now. My previous life, I call my previous life as an architect. So I've always had a sort of a design background. But ever since I went self-employed, I've been wanting a more transient life, but I wasn't sure how exactly that would translate. And I'd been thinking about van life for a number of years, but I think the thing that had maybe put me off in the beginning was this idea of sort of traveling solo, coupled with the fact I don't really like driving. So I thought, why would I choose to live a lifestyle that is inherently based around driving if I'm not really that keen on driving? So I just pushed it to the back of my mind for many, many years. And then sort of lockdown came around. I had a lot of time on my hands. I was sort of partially living at my dad's house at the time, and he was putting his house on the market. And then I thought to myself, well, where do I want to be based? And the reality was that there was no one place I needed to be, and no one place that I actually wanted to be. And so I thought, well, why would I be in one place? Like there was no obvious place to base myself. And the idea of the van came back into my mind. I had time and space during lockdown. So bought an old Ford Transit, completely empty panel van. It was an ex-fleet vehicle. And then spent the next sort of six to 7 months totally converting it into a full-time off-grid tiny home. So that was completed it's about 3 years ago this month. So June 21, I completed the van build. And didn't really have any real understanding of what life would look like. The way I looked at it was, if it all goes wrong and I hate it and I just can't do it, well, I just sell the van. Like that was the worst case scenario. Couldn't hack it, wasn't for me. I could sell the van and then I could figure out a plan B. I didn't have a plan B, but obviously I could figure one out. So didn't have a backup plan, but it felt as though there wasn't a huge risk to it. I didn't have a lot of outgoings. It was just me. I was single. I don't have kids, didn't have a partner. If there is such thing as a perfect time, that was probably it. That's the way I kind of looked at it. So yeah, 3 years ago, 3 years this month, I've been sort of full-time on the road.
Wow. And I guess that's the only way you would have found out, is by doing it full time. You'd have to be all or nothing, just throw yourself in. And although it must have taken an investment of money and time and energy and learning how to convert a van. Was that new to you? Was that new skills?
Is a godsend. Yes. Lots of one thing that actually I did realize was how capable I already was. My dad is very handy, and I've grown up just observing him just constantly building things. And yes, he did help with just insights and pair of hands and just there was lots of help he gave, but I hadn't realized how much I already knew, and that was just from decades of observation growing up, and my ex-architect background. I could visualize the entire fit out and layout and interior of the van, even when it was a total blank canvas, and to see that actually come to life and me build something that I had in my mind's eye was actually quite incredible. I was so proud of the final van, because it's very easy to kind of bail on projects or to start something and not finish. And to finish this project and to see it through and then to sort of live that reality was so huge. It was such an empowering moment when that actually came to life in real time. So that was really exciting.
I can imagine that's a really empowering first step, actually, to have to. It's not like you could just decide one day and get on the road. You had to go through that process, all the learning, all the skills you were putting in creating, and then realizing, actually, I'm really good at this, and I've shown what I'm capable of, and therefore I'm going to take that feeling of empowerment on the road with me now. And you said at the start there that you didn't even like driving, so I can't really, as someone also who doesn't like driving, I can't really understand how you bridged that one. How did that happen?
I guess I saw, well, there's a few things. One was that I didn't hate driving. I've just never enjoyed driving. It was just a kind of a means to an end for me. And I thought, okay, that is an inherent part of van life, but it is not the kind of the be all and end all. It's about the places I can go to and the freedom it gives me. I guess the freedom overrode anything else. So the possibility that the van could give me massively overrode the fact that I'm not that keen on driving. And interestingly, actually, and I was the first time I did my Europe trip, I did my first Europe trip last year. Just got back from my second one. I did an 8-week Europe trip last autumn, winter. And in the lead up to that, I was absolutely terrified of driving overseas, like absolutely terrified, to the point where it almost stopped me. But again, I was like, if I don't do this, there's a whole world at my fingertips that I'm limiting myself from accessing. So again, that freedom thing overcame that terror of driving the other side of the road, and it was fine. And I think when you're driving on roads that aren't as busy as in the UK, that are very incredibly beautiful, along, you know, beautiful scenic mountain passes and things, I remember thinking to myself, I'm actually kind of enjoying driving. It was just a real, like, oh, it was just such a strange realization that I could actually give myself permission to enjoy this thing that I'd always seen as a very practical process before. And you're higher up in the van, you know, you're a bigger machine, everything feels different. And when you're driving your own little home on the back, like a little snail going down the road, it's just such a beautifully strange feeling. It's just very different to just being in a car going from A to B. The kind of the bit in between the A to B is also part of the living. Particularly when I can just like park up and stop along little views along the route, which I do a lot of. So the whole dynamic is totally different, and I could never have preempted any of that. I could never have known how it would play out. And there's been challenging things along the way. There's been it was just an abstract idea in my head for so long. And I'm kind of glad in many ways that I didn't really know what to expect, or I didn't know how it would play out, because if I'd had I don't know, or thought I'd had a greater understanding of how it would look, it could have been, could have been a barrier in some ways. I knew I was very naive going into it, and I think sometimes naivety can be a good thing, because had I known how hard it would be to build the van, or you know, the challenge that would lie ahead in just being a solo female on the road, those sorts of things could have been a barrier to, you know, got in the way of me doing it at all. But because I didn't really know what I was doing, and I just started out with a mindset of curiosity and thinking, well, if other people can do it, then I can do it, then that paved the way for just going in and figuring out as I went along, which I think sometimes can serve us very well.
Yeah, it's like having that blank canvas attitude,
Yeah.
isn't it? And also, if you'd planned ahead as to how amazing it would be, and imagining all the adventures and how wonderful it would be, then it could be a bit of a shock if actually there were challenges, which I'm sure there have been along the way. And 3 years in now, you know what you're doing. You know, you've traveled twice onto the continent as well. Do you feel like this is the life for you now, or where are you at with van life?
It's interesting, because one of the things I do find quite challenging, and I think it's one of the things that maybe people think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that, is that when you can wake up in the morning and be anywhere at all, it's actually quite overwhelming to have no structure, no anchor point, you know, no sense of being tethered. That's actually really challenging. Like I often say to people, with the ultimate freedom comes the ultimate uncertainty. You can't have one without the other. And the uncertainty part is actually really, it's an interesting one to get familiar with and just accept and kind of work with, because it can be very overwhelming. And what I like about now I have house sits dotted throughout the year is that gives me that very loose, very baseline level of structure. So if I know I'm going to be in a certain town in 3 months' time, I can sort of use that to just anchor things around in a really loose, really, you know, still a lot of freedom, but it just gives me those little nuggets of kind of anchor. And that's really helpful. You know, otherwise, if I look kind of like, oh, you know, weeks and months and years, and there's no anchor at all, I actually find that really hard. And one of the things I noticed, I guess after maybe a year of van life, 18 months of van life, is that at some point in the short to medium term, I will probably want some kind of base. So my next, I don't know when this will play out. I'm thinking maybe 2 or 3 years time would be to build a tiny house somewhere, like an off-grid tiny house that potentially I could rent out as a holiday let, and I could live there part of the time, and when it's been rented out, I'll travel in the van. So I think van life will, for the foreseeable anyway, still form a big part of how I live and work and travel. But having some kind of base, be it a tiny home or whatever else might eventually like manifest, who knows? Yeah, something that can provide a bit of an anchor point. Because the other thing is, when you're constantly traveling, creating connections and community and, you know, your regular routines, even if it's just going to a regular gym class or going to anything that you do regularly, that you'd have those communities and connections in person, you lose all that with van life. And I found that really hard. Yeah, like the sort of, and peopling on the road, you know, you're constantly the new person, so you're constantly having to be the one that initiates conversations, which I don't find that easy. So that's hard, you know. You lose community in the way that you would typically have it, so you have to work, I feel you have to work harder to create those senses of community and connections. And the van life community online is wonderful, and I have lots of people I can chat to virtually, but you know, it isn't the same as seeing people in real life. I can go for weeks without having another conversation with another real human, and like a real life human conversation. And that's for, you know, for humans that we're wired for connection and sense of belonging and community, that can be really challenging. And I didn't see those things coming. I couldn't have planned for that. Yeah, you sort of navigate it as you go along. So there's lots of unforeseen challenges with van life, and most of that is to do with the, as I kind of call it, the dark side of freedom in a way.
Yeah, it sounds like the 3 years, which is a good chunk of time, has helped you to really understand the reality of it and what is brilliant about it and what you love and what you want to keep, and how you can refine it to feel.
It's refinement.
And it's that's interesting about the structure, isn't it? Because although our past ancestors were nomadic at some point, we soon made settlements and farms and so on, and started to have that society. And we're, like you say, we're hardwired for it. It's what we've been brought up with. It's what everybody around us is doing. It's how society is kind of made up to have this location and community. And how's that been as well with kind of your own direct community and friends and family and society as a whole? Has that been challenging to kind of be doing the different thing and going outside what other people see as the norm?
I think I've been quite lucky insofar as people always know, people at this point in my life, people know, oh, that's Jo doing her thing kind of thing. Like 12 years ago when I first went vegan, that was more challenging, because until that point, I had been doing everything within my power to fit in and just almost like fly under the radar. I didn't want to stand out as different, even though ultimately inside I always had that deep calling that there was something else, or, this way wasn't my way. A lot of that was masked. I kind of pushed it down. So when I made that decision to go plant-based, and then I think in the following year quit my architecture career, that was the point in my life where I felt very different and very alone, insofar as I didn't really understand myself back then. I didn't know who my community was. I felt as I was being sort of pulled away from all of my sort of friends and family who were still doing the normal life. And there's probably part of me that resented the fact that they were still okay with normal life, because I wanted to be okay with normal life. I just wasn't. And I didn't like being different. But so that was a really challenging time, just in terms of my own mental relationship with the changes I was making, but also with other people's relationship to me. And I could feel that energetically, that there was this kind of like just struggling to realign with, okay, who am I now? So some 10, 12 years down the line, when I come to van life, like, people know it wasn't really a big deal.
You could do anything now, Jo. It wouldn't surprise anyone. It's interesting. It's that first time you make a change. And I'm 5 years vegan, so I get the vegan thing, although in the last 5 years it's become a lot more mainstream. I know. Totally. But I've done things like leave my regular job and set up a business, and people do question it, don't they? And think, oh, that's not what, because if it's not what they would do and it's not the norm, and it starts to make you doubt yourself, and you have all that kind of transition thing and being the different one. But once you've done it once for something big, I guess it becomes easier to keep stepping into the life you want to live.
yeah, and I think a lot of it is, at the time I went vegan, at the time I left my architecture career, I was very unsure about who I was. I felt like I was in this no man's land. I didn't know where I was headed, or I kind of knew I'd left behind, but I was just like, I'd let go of, the kind of the bar on one trapeze, and I was kind of like sailing through, and I hadn't got the next thing to grip onto. And so when other people did kind of mirror back their worries and fears and concerns, like that was really triggering for me, because I wasn't solid in my own understanding of myself. Whereas now I do feel much more solid in my own understanding. So if those fears are there, they don't have the same impact at all. So that, I think, was a huge difference. It wasn't that people were being difficult particularly, I didn't have any bad reactions, but I was very unstable. That's probably a better word than that, but I was very unstable within myself and where I was and what I wanted. I was coming up to 30 at that point when I went vegan and left my architecture career. So it's just a really strange point in my life where everything kind of got shifted, like totally flipped on its head. And I almost needed the external validation because I didn't have that internally. And when that wasn't there, it was a bit like, ah. Whereas it was just totally different this time around. It didn't feel like a big deal to be going off and doing van life.
Even though reality, it's a bigger thing, really, you'd say, when you
yeah, totally. No, totally. And I
kind
of hadn't really thought about the fact that, it's a much bigger thing. But it didn't feel like that. And also I think there was that certain naivety. I didn't really appreciate how much of a bigger deal it would be to just live this totally untethered life. I was like, I'm just going to go and live in a van and see what happens.
So you talked about your previous professional career as an architect, which is making sense now with your love of bridges, because I notice on your Instagram stories you're always looking out for interesting bridges on your travels. So that's amazing. And you left that career, and I'm sure this is a question a lot of people that are listening now are wondering, like, how do you make this work financially? Like, what kind of work is available to you then as you're on the road? Like, what's your career business looking like?
Well, one of the things I really loved about van life, and this wasn't the reason I did it, but it's definitely a big part of what helps the process, is that my life is incredibly cheap. Like, it's, I don't have a partner, I don't have pets, I don't have kids, I don't have other outgoings other than things that directly revolve around me. And van life itself, I don't have gas and electric bills. I'm powered by the sun. I have a 7 kilo butane bottle it's about 30 quid to refill, and I have to do that about maybe every 9 months. So, and diesel, I have to spend money on diesel. But then when I worked in architecture, I was commuting 40 minutes each way each day. And yes, I might have had a tiny little Toyota Yaris, but when I look and think about what I would have spent monthly on fuel, I don't travel particularly fast. Okay, when I was doing my Europe chunk, I spend more on fuel, but day to day, I'm not commuting anywhere. So it's probably fairly comparable in terms of, a normal fuel bills. And okay, I have to fix things on the van when they're broken, but again, people have to fix their cars when they're broken. So my living costs are really low. And so therefore, what I need to earn per month to, just kind of keep me ticking over is also really low. Like the sort of the bar to entry as such is super low. So I do design work. I build websites. I help people. The way I'm finding myself pivoting more is helping people bring all the parts of themselves together. So I find myself working with a lot of other neurodivergent people. I have ADHD, which I'm beginning to realize a lot of people who do van life also have ADHD, because there's that constant desire for novelty and newness, but having like a safe space to come back to, which is actually really good combination. So I do a lot of designer work, particularly for people who are multi-passionate and have a kind of a wellness or sort of alternative spin on what they do. The house sits are all paid, and because I've got a background in architecture and interior design, one of the things I decided to do when I began van life and launched the house sit side of the business was offer decorating services, because I've done a lot of decorating for friends in the past, and I thought, I'm in someone's house, they're going away, instead of having like tradespeople around, decorating when they're around, what about I do a changing room style thing and get paint rooms and things when they're away. So I've done that for a few people, and I charge that as a separate day rate on top of the house sit. So that's quite a fun one. So there's a few different sources of income, but I think, and I mean, when people think of van life, they think of like constantly roaming around, being totally nomadic. But there is a lot of people I know who do have a full-time fixed job, and they might park up somewhere local to where they work, say 4 nights a week, and they go traveling at the weekends, or they might have a like a seasonal job where they work full-time for 6 months and then travel for 6 months. You don't have to have a kind of a remote or digital nomad job to do van life. There are so many different ways to do it. But for me, being able to work from my laptop, it gives that total freedom. And the house sits assist that because they give those loose anchor points. And it also means I can get my washing done. So they have a practical benefit too, I'm not going to lie.
I love the creativity you've approached that with, and whether you say that's your neurodivergent brain and way of looking at things, is like, actually, what are the many different ways that I could have an income, things that you enjoy doing, things that you've got a gift for doing, things that already fit in with what you're doing, like the house sitting, the decorating. It's real life by design, isn't it? Really, life on your terms. It's amazing to hear, so inspiring. And I must admit, I felt this huge pang of jealousy with your energy bill that you mentioned, that's almost non-existent with the butane and the solar, because modern living is expensive, and we're all tethered to these homes that are so expensive to run.
I don't have those things. I don't have council tax. I just so many of the costs just aren't there for me, and I'm very aware and very grateful for those things. And it has taken a huge amount of pressure off how much I need to earn just to cover the baseline. And in a way, like, I mean, I've sometimes described it as a little bit like I have like a net zero living cost, because the house sits kind of offset, the costs in a way. I mean, I haven't worked it out. It's not, direct parallel, but like I have so little costs, and I kind of see, I mean, the house, it's our income, but I kind of see it as almost sort of bonus money. It offsets a lot of my living costs, and then it frees me up to be choosy about what I focus on as well, rather than just having to say yes to all the things that previously I would have had to because I had more overheads. And it's given me the space to really explore who I am, because I had, over the last sort of 10 years, I feel like my 30s was just such a strange decade of coming to understand who I am on lots of different levels. And then I'm 41 now, so just sort of coming into the beginning of my 40s, where there was just a lot of noise in my mind. But I feel as though van life is giving me the permission to do things differently. I'm very, instead of just sort of being quietly different, I was sort of trying to blend in whilst being different when I was like vegan, but now I'm like, do you know what, I'm not going to blend in, and let's just own that. And I think that's given me a lot of permission to just be who I am. And this lifestyle has given me a lot of physical and mental space to explore that as well. I don't have to be working full-time. I don't work full-time in terms of the amount of hours I do per week, so it's given me space, and that's probably the greatest gift that in this busy world that we could give ourselves.
I watch your stories on Instagram avidly. I don't think I hardly miss any, and I feel almost as if I'm traveling with you, and it's such a gift. And watching how you spend your day to day, and you share the struggles as well. You're very real and honest there. But seeing, the hikes that you go on, the views that you see, the adventure you go on with it all, it's phenomenal, and it is really living. You are seeing the world, and you are really living, and I can understand why that is such a draw and a big part of why you're doing what you do. It's beautiful. One thing I do want to ask you about is you said at the start that when you decided to do this and change your life and go on the van life, there were no ties, you could do that, you were single. I know that's no longer the case, Jo, and that you do have a man in your life now.
I do have a man in my life, and I mean, that's been a really interesting journey for me, because out of the last 15, 16 years, I've probably been in relationships for about 2 years of that entire period. So being single is my kind of known entity. It's like my default mode. It's my familiarity. And I wasn't desperate for a relationship, but I was very open-minded to to one. You know, I didn't want to do the rest of my life alone. Loneliness has probably been my biggest struggle for a lot of van life. I'm quite an introvert person anyway, so as I was saying before, having to be the one to initiate conversations with new people constantly is quite challenging for me. So I was aware that I just didn't want to do this thing on my own all the time. But equally, you know, freedom and the freedom that I've created is just such a fundamental part that I didn't want to compromise that. So I wasn't sure what a relationship could look like. So the guy I'm with now is another van lifer. His life is probably even more freedom driven than mine in many ways, because he leads lots of expeditions all around the globe, and he travels over to the Arctic every winter, and he does a lot of extreme stuff in his travels. And yeah, he's not full-time in his van, but he's full-time kind of on the road. He doesn't have a home base. And so figuring out what those two sort of parallel freedom-driven lives look like and how that intersects has just been a really interesting journey. And also, you know, I've been the kind of person for the last 3 years, I haven't had to plan more than a day or 2 or 3. You know, the only time I've had to plan is when I've booked house sits in, and even house sits I don't tend to book more than about 4 months in advance, because I don't plan my life more than that. And neither does he. So actually beginning to start to think, how are we going to make sure we're spending time together when neither of us tend to have this longer term planning? That's been a really interesting one for me. And just I can notice my thinky brain trying to come in and like, but I should be doing this, or this should be happening. And like, no, actually, just get rid of all that noise from society that's trying to creep back in. And well, what is like, what feels good in the moment? Like what will next month look like? I said to him the other day, let's try and be intentional around not letting more than a month go by without seeing each other. Like there might be times that's how it is for whatever reason, but let's have the intention that no more than a month will go by before we do something together. So it is. I don't know how it will play out in the longer term, but I'm finding that it's enriching my experiences. He came and traveled with me, so you would have seen my stories. I had 8 weeks in Europe. I came back last week, and in the middle section over my birthday, he joined me for about 8-9 days. And similarly, he went away to the Arctic for 8 weeks at the very beginning of the year, and I went and joined him for a week in the middle section. And it was great. And that was, I guess, in many ways, a perfect opportunity. We were doing our solo travels, and we joined each other for a section. So far, it's kind of all unfolding in its own unique, magical way. And I'm just going to continue to just observe and notice and see what unfolds, rather than trying to sort of direct it with a brain thinky way. It's more sort of leaning into what it feels like and what the next step wants to be. So
and again, there's no norm there. There's no anything to compare against, or what you should be doing.
That's quite hard. Like it's hard in that I find my head trying to come in and create comparisons, or again, you know, coming into my 40s, there's sort of this biological thing kind of like has been a really challenging thing for me over the last few years. And he's a bit younger than me, and that was again just from in terms of how we're conditioned. I was like, oh no, like it was just really noisy in my head for a little while when we were sort of figuring out, you know, if we were sort of, you know, going to make this an official relationship or not. I could feel like a lot of noise building up in my head, because it's just so easy. It wasn't necessarily what I wanted in the long term, but it's a lot easier to just be on my own, in my own little bubble, only have to think about me, only have to sort of factor when there's someone else in the equation. Obviously there's a whole other layer to consider, which is a beautiful thing, but it did trigger a lot of kind of pinky shitty noise that wasn't necessarily helpful.
And how did you meet? Did you meet online in a Vanlife
forum,
or on the road?
I tried to go to sort of the Vanlife festivals. There's a lot that happen over the summer, like sort of like camper van get together kind of festivals. He does a lot of YouTube. He's quite a big YouTuber, and so he has got quite a big social media presence. So I was aware of his name before I was aware of who he was. And I sort of think I'd seen him on the peripheries at a couple of festivals, and then there was an opportunity to hang out. And then last May, I did a big sort of 5-week road trip all around Scotland, and he spends quite a lot of time in Scotland. He's got sort of part Scottish background, and we happened to cross paths like 3 times on that trip, and we still hadn't really spoken about what was going on, but we were just obviously kind of getting closer. He joined me on a couple of house sits for, a couple of days over the summer, and then by kind of the autumn time, it was kind of like, right, what are we doing? We keep kind of we're sort of obviously, it had to be kind of like brought out into the open as a conversation. So yeah, that was the very end of last year. So far it's kind of been 6 months, which still very early days, but it's teaching me a lot about myself. That's what I'm noticing. It's just been so long since I've been around someone. I think one of the downsides as well is spending so much time alone. And this isn't just about van life. This is just, if you are someone who just by the nature of your life spends a lot of time alone, is that you don't have another person to bounce off. I can get quite spirally in my own thoughts. My kind of ADHD noisy brain can sort of pull me down a little rabbit hole, and it's really hard sometimes to catch yourself in that. Whereas, if you've got someone who knows you well, and they can say, well, hang on a minute, like, why did you say that about yourself? Or I can't always see my own blind spots, whereas he's able to mirror things back at me that maybe I couldn't do for myself. And friends can do this, and parents, and family. But I think that is also one of the downsides of spending so much time alone, particularly as if you're an overthinker, prone to a bit of anxiety or overwhelm or whatever else. You kind of get sucked into these spirals. And having community and having people that you can call upon, be it physically present or give them a call on the phone or whatever else, I'm not always very good at doing that. I'm not always very good at remembering to connect to people when maybe I could do with that. I think sometimes that's an object permanence thing. When I'm in another country, I sometimes forget people exist. And that's not because I don't love them dearly. It's just I forget, actually I could call a friend up and have a chat. I think that is partly an ADHD thing. When something's not physically in front of you, you kind of you forget it exists. And that's, all those things are challenging parts of this lifestyle.
It's another anchor for you, isn't it? Because you're right, if people aren't around, you don't think to call them. But when you're in a relationship and that's your person and you're their person, it is the kind of go-to of like, oh, I'm struggling, I'll give them a call, or they're struggling, they'll call me. And so, it's like another anchor, isn't it, to something that feels more permanent in life. And as you're, doing this for an extended length of time now, you're getting to know what you need. And he showed up. So, fascinating.
So it's also interesting, we've got similar principles insofar as the freedom element, and obviously I'm wanting to sort of think, right, okay, how can I maintain my own sense of freedom in this relationship? But equally, I'm mindful of wanting that for him too. Like it's interesting. There's sometimes times I think, oh, I wish we could, like, I don't know, spend this big chunk of time together. But equally, I'm like, but I want you to go off and do your cool stuff. I've got some house sits over the summer, which I'm grateful for, because I tend to get more work done during house sits. And he's leading an expedition in India next month, and so I won't see him for like a month. But I want that for him, as well as, oh, it'd be nice to spend time together. Like it's that really interesting observation of wanting the freedom from each other, as well as making sure there's quality time spent together. So it's just something I'm getting really curious about, how that plays out. Because it's they feel almost opposites, but equally, actually, they can really be a complementary balance,
especially for a life that is based on freedom, and you both have your own journeys that you're on, and again, it's that going away from the norm of what a relationship looks like. And you're supposed to move in together, and you're supposed to do this and get a mortgage together, like really, there are so many ways. And if it's working for both of you, then that's the right way. There is no other way than what is right for you.
Exactly.
We've talked little bits about being online and Instagram, and although I'd known you briefly beforehand, because when you were local to here and this was your base, close to where I live, our paths kind of crossed a little bit, and we've got mutual local friends and things, but I only really got to know you properly when I started following you on Instagram, which must be over a year, I don't know, maybe 2 years even, feels like quite a long time now. So what's that journey been like, being so public and open and sharing everything, but it feels like from the outside on Instagram, day by day, like it's like a journal, isn't it? That you use the stories for.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because honestly, it's been effortless. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is when I began that Instagram account, so Jo Vanlife is my sort of van life day-to-day Instagram. It was only supposed to be my own little scrapbook. I started that account when I bought the transit van back in October 2020. So I thought, well, I don't want to spam people with van stuff on what was my main account. So therefore I start up a separate one. And I didn't expect to gather a following. Like that sounds silly, but I didn't expect to find such a beautiful community. I didn't expect to. It was literally just, I don't care if anyone follows me or not. This is a place where I can just look back on my own van life journey. And I was sort of naturally just sharing stuff on my stories. I think also because I didn't have any expectation around it. There was no perfectionism around it at all. Whereas on my previous account, particularly because it was sort of, design business or whatever else, there's always an element of heaviness there in terms of the shoulds. Whereas the van life account, none of that existed because it was just a rough and ready journal that I didn't really anticipate anyone would want to see. So that made it very easy to start sharing. There was zero barrier. And secondly, one of the things I've realized a lot over the last few years, particularly now that I spend a lot of time on my own, is that I'm the kind of person that speaks to think. I process my thoughts by saying them out loud. And when I'm on my own, I mean, I do talk to myself a lot, but a lot of the time in the evenings, especially when during my Europe travels, I'll spend the evening, a couple of hours just putting things on the stories. And it's me processing my day, in real time. And it's lovely to be able to do that publicly because people can chime in and people can, I don't really care so much for likes, but what's lovely is when people say, oh, I've been there. What have you been to this place? Oh, those flowers look really beautiful. Just that feedback. It's not so much a sense of validation. It's more of, oh, I'm a real person in this world and there's other real people in the world connecting with me.
Isn't it? Yeah, connection.
So it's a sense of connection. And as you were saying, you felt like you're following along. I've had people say since I got back last week saying, oh, where are you taking us next? And it was just such a lovely sentiment that it felt really warming to know that there are people really enjoying following my little escapades and adventures, and even the more mundane day-to-day stuff when I'm maybe in a house sit and I'm just walking a dog. And but I'm still kind of brain dumping my thoughts a lot of the time. And I genuinely enjoy showing up to do that. I've been lucky that I haven't had, if any, but very rarely kind of any trolls or any, horrible comments or anything like that. It's mostly just really lovely, wholesome followers. And so I think because it was never a business account and I never had any expectations and I naturally share things in order to process my own life, it sort of just created its own momentum. And I've realized, oh, some people want to follow me and I'm wanting to follow other van lifers. So I think one of the hardest parts for me was when that built a bit of momentum and I enjoyed showing up there. I had this other account that was in theory my main account that I didn't know what I was doing in that space anymore. I was like, well, who am I in this space when everything I do day to day is over on this account? Like the feeling in between those two Instagram accounts was like day and night. One was effortless, the other one felt heavy. I didn't want to blend the two because I felt as though I wanted to kind of keep things separate. But it was a really weird thing to notice how effortless one was, but how heavy the other space felt. And it was just the same platform. It was the same social media. So that's been an interesting journey and one I'm still kind of navigating in terms of who I am and how I show up in the other space. That was always the original account. But I do think, when you don't have any expectations around something, it just makes everything so much easier because there's just no noise and no shoulds. There's no perfectionism. And they're all the things that I think can, even if it's subconscious, even if it's just, there in the background and kind of under the radar, if those things are playing into what you share and how you share, it can it can just make things very heavy. The other reason I like to share things on a daily basis is if I kind of like, if I did a ton of travel and then I wanted to share bits at the end, I'd just feel overwhelmed because wouldn't know where to start. Whereas if I kind of keep the daily momentum, I don't have that overwhelm of like, oh my God, I've done so much stuff in the last week, I don't know how to share it now. So sometimes it did mean going to bed about 1 a.m. because I was like, I haven't shared my stories yet. But that was just, that was on me to just, or there was sometimes I'd parked up somewhere, I just didn't have enough signal, so I'd have to share things the following morning. But it wasn't from a place of needing to, from like a business point of view. It's like I know it will help me just process my day, and I can then move into the next day and be present with the next day if I've processed the one that came before. And I do tend to do things I pack a lot in. I'm not very good at just anything in life, doing things like a consistent energy level over a period of time. I'm like, do all the things, and then I'll like have a period of time where I just sit and do nothing. So that's the beauty of the house sits as well. I can have a really busy travel chunk, be it in the UK or Europe, and then I can think, right, I've got a 2.5-week house sit and I'll barely leave the house. So the extremes are just how I work. I spent so many years trying to do things in a more consistent and a more just a more consistent, energetic way. But that's just not how I am. It's kind of like, let's go hyper focus and then we'll have some downtime. And now I've given myself permission to do things that way, and actually tell myself that's an absolutely okay way to do things, because I'm running my own business. I can do things however I want. I don't have to work full-time hours in the sort of the 9 to 5, 5 days a week, give myself these bits of holidays or whatever. I'm never going to fit into that. That's not my natural rhythm. So the more and more I lean into that, everything just becomes easier. Yeah, and it's taken a long time to give myself permission to do that. Like sometimes I think it's very easy to intellectually understand maybe what we could be doing differently, but to allow us that to drop down and allow that to happen, and to have that, oh, okay, this is kind of what I need to do. Like that can sometimes take years to sort of fully embody those learnings, those teachings, the things you read in the book that intellectually it makes sense, but to embody it for whatever reason, it sometimes takes me years to get it at a kind of a cellular level. And that can be really frustrating because you kind of know you're in this in between thing of like, why can't I just allow myself to do this thing? But yeah, for whatever reason, it sometimes takes me years. But there's been a lot of permission giving over the last decade, and probably a lot more to come.
Yeah, keep going. You're doing it the right way. Oh, it's been amazing to speak to you, Jo. I wanted this conversation for myself as much as to share it with the listeners, because when you described how you talk about you talk to your stories, and it just feels very natural for you to do that and to document your time. It really does come across that way, and it's very easy to connect with you online, and to just feel like you're a part, like your other followers are saying, being a part of the journey, and the photography and the videos and the wildlife and everything else you share is just amazing. But it's that connection that's so beautiful. So I can really, really feel that in what you're doing. And my last question that I ask everybody on the podcast, and I look forward to your answer, is what brings you joy, Jo?
It's funny because when you pop this in your email about this is the question that I always ask at the end, and the first thing that came to me it's the small moments. It's the small moments, because you mentioned earlier, I have a bit of a thing for bridges. I love things that have like function and aesthetics, like that sweet spot. And if I see a lovely bridge, I can just stand there and just like, oh, and it makes me so happy. But equally, like a really lovely stone or like a beautifully formed shell, I can just like gaze, and I'm so present in those moments. And I'll be standing on a beach at like 3 p.m. on a Monday afternoon. I'm thinking, I've created a life where I can be doing this. At 3 p.m. on Monday, I'm standing on a beach looking at a shell. And when I, zoom out of my life almost and just look at that little micro moment of my day, and I can be so present to it, it's such a pure like joy. And it's in those, giving yourself the space to have those moments of total presence with the world around you and those kind of intersections. It's just, that's, yeah, like, and van life lends itself to that so well, because it forces you to be very present. And so I guess, yeah, noticing how present I am in a moment that might be before me, those are the times where nothing else, it's almost like the world stops still just for those seconds. And that's probably, I guess, the ultimate joy.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's really wonderful. And of course, our listeners can follow you on Instagram is the best place to find you.
Yeah, jo.vanlife is where I am day to day, basically. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we'll put the link in the show notes so that they can follow through and follow along your next adventures. Thank you so much for joining us, Jo.
Thank you.
Really
it's been
good
lovely
to hear more about your life. It's so inspiring. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Fertile Mindset podcast. Please rate and review, and remember to follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you are listening. Now, if this conversation has sparked something within you and you want to live your life with clarity, purpose, and joy, then I would love you to sign up for my daily seeds emails. They're delivered to you each day, giving you messages of support and planting seeds of inspiration. You'll also receive welcome gifts from me, including an EFT tuition video and some of my favourite tapping exercises to clear overwhelm, reduce stress, help you focus, and more, all completely free of charge. I'll also keep in touch with you about upcoming events and support that I think you'll like. Go to fertilemindset.com/dailyseeds to sign up. And I'll see you again next week for another episode of the Fertile Mindset podcast.